Migration Conversations is a podcast that invites persons to share their migration stories. Hosted by myself, Professor Jamie Liu, each episode is an in-depth conversation with people who have experienced the Canadian immigration system or other migration regimes up close. We talk to migrants, immigrants, lawyers, policymakers, advocates, and experts. We hope that these conversations shed light on the challenges migrants face through their own voices. So on today's episode, we are very fortunate to have Canada's representative to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees joining us today. Rima Jamous-Imseis started her mandate in January 2020. She is a native of Toronto and has been the Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa Bureau. Before joining UNHCR, she held numerous international assignments, notably as head of the United Nations Regional Office for the coordination of humanitarian affairs in Cairo, and as Special Assistant to the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process in Jerusalem. Welcome, Rima.
Thanks, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Rima, I wondered if you could tell our listeners who may not be familiar with the work of the UNHCR, what is the UNHCR and what does it do globally?
Sure, happy to do that. UNHCR, Jamie, is a multilateral intergovernmental institution. So the membership of the agency is composed of governments rather than individuals or other organizations. It was established by the UN General Assembly, which is one of the main organs of the UN, in 1949, just in the wake of the Second World War, to deal with the refugee crisis coming out of that conflict. And in fact, this year marks our 70th anniversary. UNHCR is primarily mandated to provide international protection and humanitarian assistance and to try and identify durable solutions for people that come under our mandate. So what does that mean, who comes under our mandate? Our core mandate relates to refugees, but with time, because most UN agencies actually begin as temporary entities that are meant to deal with a particular crisis and then hopefully one day wind up. Well, as history has shown us, that wasn't the case for UNHCR and many other parts of the UN system, unfortunately. But we started out covering refugees, and over time, to respond to various emergencies around the world and the evolution of displacement, we also now cover returnees or people who have returned to their country of origin to help with that reintegration process. And we also deal with stateless people. And although we don't have a general mandate for the internally displaced, we do play a role in certain conflict situations in supporting displaced people internally displaced people by providing protection and humanitarian assistance. So as I said, this year marks our 70th anniversary, and unfortunately, we mark that anniversary with an all-time high of record global displacement, which sits at about 80 million right now. And UNHCR currently operates in about just over 130 countries worldwide, and many of our colleagues are working in very dangerous, insecure, and remote locations around the world.
That sounds fascinating, Rima. I know that UNHCR has a local presence in a lot of different places in the world, as you mentioned, but UNHCR also has an office in Canada. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about the work that UNHCR in Canada does and how it may be similar or different to the work that it does in other locations.
So the work we do here in Canada, Jamie, is actually substantially different than what we would do in a field operation, because we're not on the front lines of an emergency or a humanitarian crisis, where the immediate requirement is to provide the basic necessities of life, like food and shelter, and medical assistance, basic protection for people who are fleeing. So we're not sitting in that kind of a situation here in Canada, and that necessarily means that what we do here is quite different. Primarily, one of our main objectives here is to mobilize support, be it political support or financial support, for refugees and refugee issues globally, and also for our operations. So what does that mean in practical terms? It means shining a light on emergencies that are unfolding, whether they be new or more recent emergencies like what we see in Venezuela here in the Americas, or more protracted, long-lasting crises like what we have in Syria, or if you even wanted to go way back to perhaps the Sahrawi caseload, who've been sitting in refugee camps in Algeria for decades. So we try to shine a light on that and generate support, financial support, political support for those operations and for refugees around the world. And we're very fortunate because Canada is a global leader on refugee issues and refugee protection. So being able to work with Canada to advance asylum policies and procedures around the world is something we're able to do here in Canada, and it's unique. We don't often get to do that with governments, but we lean on Canada to use their capacity, their experience, and the sophisticated asylum system we have here to help build capacity in other countries. So for instance, at the moment, we have an ongoing project with Mexico, with the government of Mexico, and that's been on for some time. And we use best practices from Canada in order to strengthen asylum systems in other places around the world. Another way that Canada is unique, and which makes our work rather unique, is that Canada at the moment, for the second year running actually, is the largest resettlement country globally. So that does consume a lot of our time here, working specifically on the issue of resettlement. And one of the things we do with the Canadian government, but not uniquely so, is to work on emergency resettlement cases where you have situations of extreme urgency and resettlement becomes a life-saving tool. So one of the things we do is we turn to the Government of Canada, other governments as well, in order to try and find emergency expedited resettlement for very urgent cases. And maybe just a last word about innovation, because we are fortunate enough to be in a country with a very mature asylum system. We're able to turn our minds to innovative practices and to see how the evolution of support towards refugees and refugee issues can take us to areas maybe we haven't yet had an opportunity to explore. And here I'm thinking of the Global Compact on Refugees, which has only been with us since December 2018. But the idea there is that we shift our response and our mindset as an international community to provide support to refugees in a very different way, a whole of society integrated way, so that refugees are very much at the table, driving the process, contributing to solutions. And the Global Compact encourages that very spirit. And so here in Canada, what we've done is tried to work with the government to pilot some new ideas. And one of the most exciting, actually, which looks like it's probably going to take off in a big way, is something we call labor mobility. And that's essentially opening up economic immigration to skilled refugees, and doing so recognizes the fact that refugees, in fact, bring something to the table, skills, expertise, and they can contribute to a country, especially in areas where you have persistent labor shortages in a particular sector. And then you free up resettlement spaces. So that allows you to then address the resettlement needs and the vulnerabilities of other people out there who might not otherwise have a chance to seek that kind of protection.
Rima, that all sounds super fascinating, and certainly those of us in the refugee advocacy community are excited about all the initiatives that UNHCR undertakes in Canada, and see UNHCR as a partner in a lot of the work that needs to be done in the refugee sector. Rima, you started your mandate in January, and welcome, by the way.
Thank you.
And shortly thereafter, the pandemic hit, and I wondered if you could talk about the challenges UNHCR is facing in relation to the pandemic, whether internationally or in Canada, and how it has in general impacted the work that UNHCR and others may be doing in assisting and supporting refugees.
Well, regrettably, Jamie, this actually has had quite a dramatic impact. COVID has, in fact, created probably what is the most serious challenge to well-established fundamental norms of refugee law in a way that we've never seen over the 70-year history of our organization. What does that mean in real terms? Of course, at the beginning, with the onset of the pandemic, we acknowledged immediately as UNHCR that governments needed to respond to the global health crisis and, to enact measures in order to safeguard their populations. But we also sent the very strong message that safeguarding asylum or the right to claim asylum is not necessarily inconsistent with protecting your citizens. And we offered a number of practical measures in order to help governments be able to balance those two things and ensure that asylum seekers were still able to access territory. We've also been sending the message since day one that any restrictions that governments impose really should be temporary and they should be proportionate to the risk that a particular country faces. And with all that, we still made the plea and continue to do so that they keep their doors open for emergency cases. So the kind of resettlement of an emergency, urgent nature that really is life-saving when people are facing a life or death situation. So those are the messages we've been sharing with governments since the beginning. But COVID has moved on and has really become something that has challenged basic understandings and practices that we've had in place for a very long time. The most obvious way this has manifested itself is through the border closures that we've seen in countries around the world. And since March, 168 countries have actually closed their borders, and 100 of those countries have closed them completely to asylum seekers and refugees. So you can imagine what kind of impact that has in terms of preventing the access to territory and the right to be able to make that claim. We've also unfortunately seen refoulement taking place, and we have cases of governments sending individuals back to places where we know they face persecution and other forms of risk. The other very practical way that COVID has impacted our work is that it has largely halted national asylum systems and procedures in many countries around the world, slowing things down and creating even bigger backlogs in places that already had quite sizable caseloads. Here in Canada and in other places, of course, because travel was severely interrupted and restricted, we've had to essentially halt resettlement, all but the most pressing emergency cases, and even those are just a handful. Now, fortunately, we have now tried to pick that up as travel routes have opened again, but we have, again, quite a backlog there, and so resettlement has really seen a suspension that will take probably months and months to catch up from. Like here and in other places of the world, we've seen severe disruptions to education, serious increases in instances and reports of SGBV, and sadly, and perhaps one of the most insidious consequences of the pandemic is really, really disturbing incidences of xenophobia and racist rhetoric and attacks, actual attacks on refugees and asylum seekers in various places in the world. And I mean, if we were to try and imagine for a moment what a refugee camp looks like, or a country that's already struggling with development issues and poverty, and this is where, by the way, the majority of refugees are actually residing at the moment, that people stay close to their homes in the hope that they can go back. So they're in neighboring countries that are also afflicted with different development issues. But imagine where you have the majority of refugees sitting in countries that have very weak health systems, and now contrast that to a city like New York or a city like Madrid, and how those countries with very sophisticated and mature health systems and infrastructure almost collapsed under the weight of the pandemic. Now, just imagine how these countries, without all of that support and all of that infrastructure, are going to be coping with the pandemic. Now, fortunately, we haven't seen a major outbreak to date in any of our camps, but we've tried very much to prepare for the eventuality that may happen, and we're not out of the woods yet, so we don't know what will come. But I think fundamentally, Jamie, what COVID has shown us in Canada and around the world is it really does exacerbate existing inequalities, right? So refugees who largely rely on the informal sector and day labor or opportunities to earn an income saw their livelihoods vanish overnight with lockdowns around the world. And people, in fact, large communities of refugees who were previously self-sustaining all came forward by the hundreds of thousands, and in some instances the millions, to seek support because they could no longer stand on their own feet. So to say that the impact has been dramatic is something of an understatement, but it really has changed the way we're working.
Yeah, listening to you has been very disturbing. I would say that it's been difficult, I would say, for everyone. The pandemic has exposed a lot of challenges for everyone, but I think, a lot of people may not realize how difficult it might be to be a refugee in today's world, and how the structural and the assumptions or the things that we took for granted are now exposing the difficulties that we have in an interconnected world, and how much support and assistance people may need, and how it may shift and change given the times that we're in. So I'm grateful that you're able to share some of that with us and talk about the things that UNHCR may be doing to alleviate some of that situation. Aside from the pandemic, before the pandemic, refugee issues and crises around the world were very much flaring up and alive. Aside from the pandemic, what is, in your opinion, are the challenges that UNHCR faces today, seeking to address? What are their priorities in the next couple of years from a global perspective, but also more locally in your office as you are dealing with issues here in Canada?
Well, unfortunately, there are quite a number of issues on our radar screen that keep us awake at night. And one of them is, as I mentioned earlier, the dramatic increase in global displacement. And this is not just, rhetoric. This is borne out by the numbers. Every June, we release a global report where we document the number of displaced people globally. And last month, or rather this past June, we had the misfortune to reach yet another global milestone, and one which we had hoped we would never get to. But nearly 80 million people globally who are displaced, the highest figure ever since we started recording and collecting this information, and a jump of just 10 million from last year. So we are sitting in a situation where, unfortunately, global displacement is growing, and we only have reason to believe that that's going to continue as a trend. Why do we believe that? Well, there's a few reasons. First, conflict is pervasive around the world. You only have to look at your news headlines to see that there's no shortage of conflict playing out in any quarter of the world at the moment. And the sad reality is that when you are displaced due to conflict, the tendency has now been that it's for the medium to long term. It's not a short-term displacement. And there's a very real reason why that is the case. And that's unfortunately because much of this displacement is now driven by political problems and political conflict. And in order to resolve those issues, you need political solutions. Humanitarian responses will never be a substitute for that. And we also find that, unfortunately, international organs, members of the international community, just seem to be locked in this state of paralysis. The Security Council is a really good example of that, where you can't even over a 4-month period agree on a resolution concerning COVID. I mean, never mind the intractable, difficult political questions with, high strategic interests involved with, from various member states. So you have this inability to address the root causes and to really get at the political solutions that need to be in place in order to overcome this displacement. And we're seeing global poverty levels increasing. The pandemic has only exacerbated that. In fact, dramatically exacerbated that. And unfortunately, you just see a perpetuation of conflict and insecurity. So all of those ingredients make the conditions ripe for continued displacement. And I fear that that's what we're going to see going forward. At the same time, you really do have limited solutions. I spoke at the beginning about the fact that as UNHCR, our mandate includes the search for and identification of durable solutions for refugees, but solutions are ultra limited. In fact, resettlement, which is one of the main tools we have at our disposal, is a tiny is available to a tiny proportion of refugees. In fact, I think that the percent, just to give you an idea of the scope, is that only 0.5% of refugees globally were resettled last year. So that is not going to offer us the scale and the magnitude of solutions we need to address global displacement. So that's something that weighs heavily on us, and definitely is a key advocacy point with governments around the world every single day. Post-COVID, or in the middle of COVID, because we're not quite there yet where we can say it's post-COVID, but we're seeing a global economic crisis play out at the moment. So, traditionally humanitarian situations around the world benefited from strong support from donor countries. And through the initial first few months of COVID, we've seen that support stay steadfast, and we've been very grateful for that. But as countries wake up to the impact of COVID and continue to feel a serious economic downturn in their own countries, are they still going to be supportive of refugees and providing assistance to them globally? That's something that, if you were to see a second wave, a third wave, and continued economic decline, are we still going to have the support of those countries? That's something that weighs on us very heavily right now. And then maybe just thinking about here in Canada, obviously resettlement and its impact, because as I said at the outset, Canada is the largest resettlement country globally. So those people who really face these life-threatening situations and need to be resettled in a third country and have had all of that come to a screeching halt during COVID, makes you, pause for a moment and see that even as routes slowly begin to open up, are we going to be in a position to resettle all of those people who are in the pipeline and waiting to begin their lives anew in a safe and protected environment? Are we going to be able to get past the restrictions that we've seen in place for quite some time now? Are we going to be able to meet those targets? Because even though it is such a limited solution, it is a solution nonetheless, and we rely on it quite heavily. So those are some of the issues that we're grappling with at the moment.
That's certainly a lot, and I can certainly understand the concerns that you've highlighted, especially post-pandemic, and how the economic, political, and social challenges facing us after the pandemic may also trickle down and affect the way in which we respond to the various crises and needs around the world. I wanted to shift to a question more locally. And in Canada, as you know, many of us are preoccupied with refugees at the Canada-US border. There's been a lot of media attention, political attention at that border, pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. And the federal court has recently issued a decision finding the Safe Third Country Agreement, violating refugee claimants' Section 7 charter rights, does the UNHCR hope to provide some guidance or advice to the Canadian government about how to proceed as they review their options on how to respond to this legal decision?
Well, in fact, it's a very pertinent question, very timely, and I'm not sure how familiar the listeners are with the Safe Third Country Agreement, but it's interesting to go back to the original agreement from 2004 and see that UNHCR was actually given a special role in the agreement and asked to monitor implementation and then report back on it 1 year into the life of the agreement. So there was always foreseen a degree of communication and feedback from UNHCR on the Safe Third Country Agreement. And as you may know, Canada and the US are not the only countries in which we see these kinds of agreements globally. And we've been very fortunate to enjoy a strong relationship with the government and have an open dialogue on refugee issues, including the Safe Third Country Agreement. And like we do globally, because this is part of our mandate, we do engage with governments. We provide guidance, we provide feedback and advice in order to ensure that, you know, refugee protections are the strongest that they can be, but also that governments are actually living up to their international legal commitments. And here in Canada, that has always been the case traditionally, and the government has often sought our counsel to ensure that policies and practices are actually upholding those commitments. So we, to date, have not had a conversation with the government on the federal court decision. But as I said, we stand ready to provide that support and that feedback whenever it's required in Canada and everywhere else that we work.
Thank you, Rima. Rima, many listeners to this podcast will be students and students who may want to pursue either a legal career or a diplomatic or an international career in refugee law or refugee issues. Can you tell me more about your career trajectory? How did you arrive at the UNHCR? And what advice would you have for students wanting to pursue similar types of work?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's an incredibly rewarding career. And I'm incredibly privileged to have worked and lived in the places that I have and to be able to travel and meet people around the world in this line of work. And I would strongly encourage anybody who's interested to chase that relentlessly, because you will have no regrets. If you have interest in international affairs, if you're interested in human rights and humanitarian issues, this international career platform, it has so many different options and opportunities available. And I would say that law is a fantastic entry point to that. I myself started actually in a very small local NGO in the Gaza Strip. And that was really where I made my interest known. And I was lucky enough, because of my Canadian legal experience, my education, my language skills, I was really lucky to have an opportunity there. And I spent a few months there looking at the judiciary and doing a report for them on that. And from there, I transitioned into the UN, first in a political capacity in the UN Special Coordinator's Office for the Middle East Peace Process. And then I was really lucky because I was also able to work in a legal capacity later on and a humanitarian one as well. So I've been rather unique in the sense that I've kind of moved around within the UN system and have been able to do different types of work and in different pillars. So that's been extremely rewarding. One thing I would say to anybody contemplating this type of a career is to really get in at the ground floor and don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. In fact, you want to get your hands dirty. That's where you're going to get the best experience, and that's where you're going to really be able to shape, develop, and hone your skills, and where you're then able to really contribute in a very powerful way as you move forward in your career, because you've had firsthand experience on the front lines and you can speak from that very authoritative position of having been there and contributed and been part of that kind of a response. So entry level, I'd say internships, seek them out. Students are very lucky today because in my day there were no paid internships, and now they do offer stipends. So if you're able to get into an internship position, it can often lead to opportunities. So I would strongly consider, even if you think you might be a bit overqualified for something entry level, it's a great way to get a foot in the door. And the other really good way of doing it, and which so many UN staff take as the route into a UN career, is to work for a very small local non-governmental organization. Those are the kinds of places that will be really small and have limited capacity, and so you'll be able to do things that you wouldn't otherwise get to do in a bigger organization, and really get a chance to spread your wings and learn a little bit about the field, and get your hands dirty, as I said. Canadians are very well regarded internationally because of our strong education system and our work ethic. And so that is a big advantage that students will have as they try to market themselves and sell their skills out there in the world. And don't be afraid to call on people you know who may be working in the system to put in a good word, because it is the case that, you know, managers are often looking to bring people in on the basis of strong reputations and a track record. So don't be afraid to knock on doors and maybe put yourself out there in a way that you wouldn't otherwise feel comfortable doing if you were job hunting here in Canada. And go straight to the field. Don't even think twice about it. If you have any interest in an international career, I'd say stay away from headquarters locations. The more remote the place, the better. And your experience will be incredibly enriching and will shape the rest of your career moving forward.
Thank you, Rima. Such an interesting career that you've had. Your exemplary trajectory in your career certainly, I think, will inform the role that you have here in Canada, and we're so lucky to have you as Canada's representative for the UNHCR. So I just wanted to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule and the many things that you have on your plate to speak with me today, and to wish you the best as you embark on your mandate here in Canada.
Thank you, Jamie.
Migration Conversations is created and hosted by me, Professor Jamie Liu, and produced by University of Ottawa Tech Law Fellow June Gleed. This podcast was made possible with the guidance and assistance of University of Ottawa Tech Law Fellow Ritesh Kotak, Carleton University graduate student Rachel McNally, as well as the generous support of Carleton University and the University of Ottawa shared online projects and initiatives. You can find more Migration Conversations episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube with closed captions. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you for all the guests who have shared their experiences publicly.